scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction too late. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast in eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she saw that Mummy Pig's eyes had turned completely black, like dark holes in her face. Yet she continued cooking as if nothing had changed. George came running into the kitchen, but his pink skin seemed to shimmer and shift. When he opened his mouth to say dinosaur, the word came out as a low, haunting whisper that echoed through the house. Daddy Pig appeared at the breakfast table, but his glasses reflected images that weren't in the room. In the lenses, Peppa could see twisted versions of their house. When Daddy Pig smiled, his teeth had become sharp and pointed. The family sat down to eat, but the food on their plates kept changing. One moment it was bacon and eggs, the next it was something dark and writhing. Peppa tried to speak, but her voice sounded far away. Outside, the familiar green hills had turned gray and barren. The trees had no leaves, and their branches reached toward the house like grasping fingers. Other houses stood empty with dark windows that seemed to watch her. When they decided to visit Grandpa Pig's farm, the car ride felt endless. The road stretched on forever, and no matter how long they drove, they never got closer. The landscape kept repeating itself, like they were trapped in a loop. At the farm, Grandpa Pig was tending vegetables that had grown into impossible shapes. The carrots were twisted into spirals, and the potatoes had eyes that blinked when no one was looking. The chickens had stopped clucking and instead made sounds like whispered secrets. Their feathers had turned midnight blue, and they moved in perfect synchronization. When Peppa tried to feed them, they all turned to look at her with glowing eyes. As the day wore on, strange things continued. The sun stopped moving across the sky, freezing directly overhead. Shadows began to move independently, creeping across the ground like living things. When evening should have come, the sky remained the same pale, sickly color. The family gathered to watch television, but every channel showed an empty room that looked exactly like theirs, but with no one in it. Peppa tried to go to bed, but her bedroom had changed. The walls seemed to stretch higher than before, and her bed felt like it was floating in an endless void. When she closed her eyes, she could hear voices calling her name. In the morning, everything had returned to normal. But as she looked in the mirror while brushing her teeth, her reflection was smiling even though she wasn't. In the background, she could see shadowy figures. The family went about their day as usual, but Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that they were all just pretending. Every smile seemed forced, every laugh sounded hollow. She began to wonder if the strange day had ever really ended, or if this was just another part of the nightmare that would never end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening in the Pig family house when something extraordinary began to happen. Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom when they noticed their toys behaving strangely. The teddy bears seemed to be watching them with unblinking button eyes, and the toy dinosaur that George loved so much appeared to move slightly when no one was looking directly at it. Mummy Pig was downstairs preparing dinner when she heard an unusual sound coming from the children's room. It wasn't the normal laughter and chatter she was used to hearing. Instead, there was an eerie silence punctuated by soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She called up to the children, but received no response. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper when the television began changing channels by itself. Each channel showed the same thing, an empty playground with swings moving back and forth in the wind, even though there was no wind visible anywhere else. The playground looked exactly like the one where Peppa and her friends usually played, but something was fundamentally wrong with it. Upstairs, Peppa and George discovered that their bedroom door had somehow locked itself from the outside. They tried calling for their parents, but their voices seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves. The room began to feel smaller, as if the walls were slowly moving inward. Their toys had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the children, all facing them with expressions that had somehow changed from friendly to menacing. The family portraits hanging on the walls throughout the house began to shift and change. In each picture, the smiling faces of the pig family gradually transformed into expressions of concern, then worry, then outright fear. It was as if the photographs were trying to warn the real family about something terrible that was approaching. As night fell, the house itself seemed to come alive. Doors creaked open and closed on their own. Footsteps echoed through empty hallways, and whispers filled every room. The kitchen appliances turned themselves on and off in a rhythmic pattern that almost sounded like a heartbeat. Grandpa Pig arrived for his usual evening visit, but when he knocked on the front door, it swung open to reveal a house that looked exactly the same yet felt completely different. The familiar yellow walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The children found themselves drawn to the window, where they could see their neighborhood transformed. All the houses looked identical to theirs, stretching endlessly in every direction. Other families could be seen through the windows, but they all moved in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by some unseen force. The final realization came when they looked in the mirrors throughout their house and saw not their own reflections, but the reflections of a different family entirely. A family that looked exactly like them, but with eyes that held no recognition, no warmth, no life. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed in her favorite red dress, she noticed her reflection in the mirror was smiling even though she wasn't. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her movements were too mechanical, too precise. She flipped pancakes with the exact same motion over and over again, never blinking, never stopping. When Peppa said good morning, Mummy Pig turned around with that same perfect smile, but her eyes were completely black. George was already at the breakfast table, playing with his toy dinosaur as always. But today, the dinosaur seemed to be moving on its own, its tiny plastic head turning to watch Peppa as she sat down. George giggled, but the sound was wrong, too deep, too knowing for a little pig his age. Daddy Pig came down the stairs, his newspaper in hand, but when he opened it, all the pages were blank except for one headline that read, "They're watching you, Peppa," in dripping red letters. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual and began reading aloud from the empty pages about weather that would never come. After breakfast, Peppa decided to visit her best friend Susie Sheep. The walk to Susie's house felt longer than usual, and the familiar streets seemed to stretch endlessly. The houses she passed had windows that followed her movement, and the cheerful yellow sun in the sky had developed a sinister grin. When she arrived at Susie's house, everything looked normal from the outside. But when Susie answered the door, her wool was matted and dark, and her eyes had the same black emptiness as Mummy Pig's. Susie invited her in with a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. Inside Susie's house, all the furniture was floating 3 feet off the ground, rotating slowly in perfect circles. Susie's family sat in their floating chairs, having tea in midair, acting as if nothing was wrong. They offered Peppa a cup of tea that steamed with purple vapor and smelled like old flowers. As Peppa tried to leave, she realized the door wouldn't open. The windows showed only darkness outside, even though it had been bright daylight moments before. Susie and her family continued their floating tea party, their heads turning in unison to stare at Peppa with those terrible black eyes. Suddenly, Peppa found herself back in her own house, but everything was wrong. The walls were breathing, expanding, and contracting like lungs. The family portraits on the walls showed twisted versions of themselves with too many eyes and smiles that stretched beyond their faces. In the living room, the television was on, but it only showed static. Within the static, Peppa could see shapes moving, reaching toward the screen as if trying to escape. The purple sofa had grown teeth along its edges, and the coffee table was covered in photographs of Peppa sleeping, taken from impossible angles. George appeared in the doorway, but he was wrong too. His body stretched upward like taffy, and when he spoke, his voice came from behind Peppa instead of from his mouth. He asked if she wanted to play a game, but the game was to count how many eyes were watching them from the walls. Mummy and Daddy Pig joined them in the living room, but they moved like marionettes, their limbs jerky and unnatural. They sat down for their usual evening routine, but instead of talking about their day, they spoke in unison about how much they loved having Peppa home forever and ever and ever. The house began to shake, and through the windows, Peppa could see that their yellow house was now floating in a void of absolute darkness. There were no other houses, no ground, no sky, just their home suspended in nothingness while her family continued their impossible routine. As night fell inside the floating house, Peppa realized that tomorrow would be exactly the same. She would wake up, see her wrong reflection, have breakfast with her black-eyed family, visit Susie's floating house, and return to walls that breathed and furniture that watched. And she would do it again and again, forever, in this place that looked like home but was something else entirely. The last thing Peppa saw before the darkness took her was her own reflection in the television screen. But this time, her reflection was smiling that same terrible smile, and its eyes had turned completely black. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa discovered an old music box in the attic. The melody it played was hauntingly beautiful, but something about it felt wrong. As the tune filled the house, the walls began to shift and breathe like living things. Peppa called for Mummy Pig, but her voice echoed back distorted and strange. The music box wouldn't stop playing, even when Peppa tried to close it. The melody grew louder and more twisted with each note. George appeared in the doorway, but his eyes were completely black, and he moved in jerky, unnatural motions. He spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, asking Peppa to dance to the cursed tune. Mummy Pig came upstairs, but she was different too. Her smile was too wide, stretching beyond what should be possible. She began to dance to the music box melody, spinning faster and faster until she became a blur. Daddy Pig joined them, his glasses reflecting not the room, but endless darkness. The house itself started dancing to the rhythm. Furniture moved on its own. Pictures on the walls began to sway, and the floorboards creaked in perfect time with the music. Peppa realized she was the only one who could see what was really happening. Everyone else seemed trapped in the music box's spell. As the melody reached its crescendo, Peppa noticed that her family members were becoming more and more like dolls. Their movements became mechanical, their faces painted and fixed. The music box...
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer than usual, and the familiar sounds of birds chirping were replaced by an eerie silence. Peppa looked around her room. Everything appeared normal, but the family portraits on the wall seemed to be watching her with eyes that followed her movement. When she reached the kitchen, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast with her back turned. "Good morning, Mummy," Peppa said, but Mummy Pig didn't respond. She continued stirring mechanically, and her reflection in the window showed a completely different expression of fear, even though her actual face remained calm and smiling. Daddy Pig entered reading his newspaper, but the headlines kept changing before Peppa's eyes. First, beautiful day ahead, then strange occurrences reported, and finally, nothing is as it seems. When he lowered the paper, his glasses reflected shadowy figures moving behind Peppa, though when she turned around, nothing was there. George bounced in with Mr. Dinosaur, but the toy's plastic eyes had turned completely black, and seemed to move on its own when George wasn't looking. During breakfast, Peppa realized everyone was eating the same spoonful over and over, stuck in a loop, responding with identical words from yesterday. Peppa decided to visit Susie's sheep. Walking through town, she noticed all the animal families doing the exact same activities as yesterday. Candy Cat playing with the same ball, Pedro Pony riding in the same pattern, Rebecca Rabbit hopping in the same rhythm. At Susie's house, her friend sat staring at the sky with complete stillness, wool moving as if blown by unfelt wind. "Hello, Peppa," Susie said with a smile too wide and eyes that looked right through her. "Would you like to play the same game we played yesterday and the day before?" Peppa couldn't remember what game or what had happened yesterday. The sun hadn't moved in the sky, clouds remained in identical positions, and the town clock showed the same time. Every path Peppa took led back to where she started. Most frightening was when she looked in a mirror. Her reflection was doing things she wasn't doing, waving when she stood still, frowning when she smiled, mouthing words she wasn't speaking. As evening approached without the sun setting, Peppa found herself back in her bedroom. Looking out the window, she saw hundreds of versions of herself, her family and friends, all doing identical activities in perfect synchronization. She realized she might not be the real Peppa at all, but just another copy in an endless cycle. The episode ended with Peppa closing her eyes and whispering, "I want to go home," not knowing she might already be there, or that home might be somewhere unreachable. When she opened her eyes, it was Tuesday morning once more, and everything began exactly as before. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. Peppa called for George, but there was no answer from his room. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing louder than they should. When Peppa reached the living room, she found George sitting on the purple sofa, but he wasn't moving. His eyes were wide open, staring at the television screen that showed nothing but static. Peppa tried to speak to him, but George didn't respond. His favorite dinosaur toy lay forgotten on the floor, its plastic eyes seeming to follow Peppa. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen, standing perfectly still at the counter. She was smiling, but her smile was too wide, stretching beyond what seemed natural. When Peppa asked what was for breakfast, Mummy Pig turned her head slowly, her neck making a soft clicking sound. Her eyes had changed color, becoming a deep, dark shade. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in his chair, but the pages were blank. He turned each empty page with mechanical precision, his glasses reflecting nothing but darkness. When Peppa approached him, she noticed that his breathing had stopped, yet he continued to turn the pages. The house began to feel smaller, as if the walls were slowly moving inward. The familiar yellow walls started to fade, becoming a sickly gray color that spread across every surface. The pictures on the walls showed the family, but their faces were blurred and distorted. Peppa ran to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed shut. Through the window, she could see that the outside world had changed. The green hill where their house sat was now barren and brown, and the sky had turned an unnatural shade of purple. The telephone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the silence. Peppa answered it, hoping to hear a familiar voice, but there was only breathing on the other end. Slow, deliberate breathing that seemed to match her own heartbeat. As the day wore on, Peppa realized that time had stopped moving forward. The clock on the wall showed the same time it had when she first woke up. The sun remained in the exact same position in the sky. Peppa tried to wake her family, shaking them gently, but they remained frozen in their positions. Their eyes followed her movements, but they never blinked, never spoke, never moved. The house filled with an oppressive silence. When night should have fallen, the light outside simply dimmed without the sun ever setting. The purple sky darkened to black, but there were no stars, no moon, just an endless void. Peppa pressed her face against the window. The last thing Peppa remembered was her own reflection in the window glass, but it wasn't quite right. Her reflection was smiling that same too wide smile.